president under pressure. As Zimbabwe's economic crisis deepens, critics of Robert Mugabe are growing more numerous and more vocal. Could he finally be losing his grip on power? Also on today's program, the Pyongyang paradox. A defiant North Korea conducts its biggest ever nuclear test, while there are other signs the Hermit Kingdom is opening up. And in picture this, 1.5 million Muslim pilgrims converge on Mount Arafat as the annual Hajj reaches its peak. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. What happened in the Arab Spring is not going to happen here. That's what Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe told supporters just last month. But can he be so sure? The country is facing economic collapse, weighed down by enormous debts, and is fast running out of cash. Against this backdrop is growing political turmoil, with a wave of anti-government protests, along with strikes by public sector workers who are angry that their salaries aren't being paid. There are also growing signs of infighting within the ruling ZANU-PF, with some senior party members now openly criticizing their leader. Even some of the war veterans, who were always among Mugabe's most staunch supporters, have now come out against him. Our newsmaker today is President Robert Mugabe, as we ask whether he's losing his grip on power after more than 35 years in charge.
Anti-government protests in Zimbabwe's capital are getting more and more violent. Opposition is mounting amid the country's crippled economy, aggravated by months of drought. Queues for ATMs that are running out of cash have become a common sight in Harare, and the trade deficit has shot up by more than 700% in the last decade. Many inside and outside the country blame Robert Mugabe, the country's longtime leader, for the country's collapsing economy.
Everything is pointing towards the fact that Mugabe has failed or is failing to manage the economy or the country of Zimbabwe. That in itself is causing people to be angry. As you know, a hungry man is an angry man.
But the 92-year-old president remains as defiant as ever against anyone who opposes his rule.
We can't allow them to continue on these violent demonstrations unimpeded.
Robert Mugabe has ruled Zimbabwe since it gained independence from Britain in 1980.
I am created as president by the people.
But 36 years in power seem to be wearing on him. And it's not just the opposition calling for him to resign. It's also some of his former allies. With rumours about the president's health, there's speculation over who will succeed him. And it's causing a divide in the ruling ZANU-PF party. On one side is Mugabe's right-hand man and vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. And on the other side, the president's wife, Grace, who's assumed an increasingly political role over the last few years. With Zimbabwe's spiralling economy, the calls for a new president are getting louder. And many are wondering whether time is running out for the man who led the country to independence. Gracie Jerome, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's start by getting a better sense of what's happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. I'm joined from Harare by Ngaba Machazi, news editor at the Independent Daily Newsday. Thanks a lot for joining us, Ngaba. So, from the outside looking in, the impression that we get is that Zimbabwe is on the brink of a terrible economic crisis, and at the moment, there's political and social instability bubbling. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, that's very quite accurate, because of the way things are right now in Zimbabwe is that there's no money, the economy is on its knees, and there's no cash in the economy, which means we have no money for importing, we have no money for basics, we have no money for anything. Even the government itself has run out of money. So the situation is really bad right now economically.
While all of this is ongoing, the president is unveiling statues of himself. Is that an indication that he's completely out of touch with what's going on?
Well, you could say that on one hand that is out of touch, but on the other hand, he's got lots of sycophantic supporters who will do anything to curry favor with him.
You say sycophantic supporters, but there's a feeling that he's probably losing his base because we're seeing criticism from within ZANU-PF, we're seeing war veterans. Is that true that he might be losing his base?
Well, I think he's losing his base. This is the first time probably since independence that he's facing such opposition. The war vets are running away from him. Some of the youths are not happy with what he's doing. And even some of the factions within his party are openly fighting him. On the other hand, he has a group of core supporters who are willing to do anything for him. Just in May, after a few demonstrations, he organized a 1 million man march for him so that he could show his support for him. And also, when other people demonstrated against him, he responded by having a youth march for him and show that they support him. So as much as he's losing support, he still has sycophantic supporters who are not willing to go anywhere anytime soon.
Ngaba, Zimbabwe went through tremendous economic turmoil in 2008, and remarkably, in many ways, it recovered to a great extent. How does this situation in 2016 compare to 8 years ago?
Well, personally, I think it's worse now than it was in 2008. Now there's a perfect storm of things gathering, all conspiring against the president. You have the economy that's on its knees, you have his age and his health, and all of a sudden, people that supported him in 2008 are all gone. The former Vice President, Joyce Mujuru, the war veterans, some youth, and because of joblessness, which has risen to about 90%, lack of money in the economy. That's why I keep saying it's a perfect storm. Everything is conspiring against the president, making this situation worse than probably it was in 2008.
Okay, Ngaba, great to get your insight there. Ngaba Mashazi joining us there from Harare. Well, joining us now from Harare is Bright Matonga, a former Deputy Information Minister under President Mugabe and now a political analyst. And from Johannesburg, I'm joined by Tino Mambo, the South African coordinator of the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Tino Mambo. When I spoke to Ngaba Machazi earlier on, he says the feeling on the ground is that the situation right now is worse than 2008. Do you agree with him?
Well, I should say I agree with the gentleman very much in those terms. You realize that in 2008 we did not have ZANU-PF militia and the presence of police on the streets as you see right now in 2016. Yesterday it was a football match between Highlanders and Dynamos, and what was visible there were armored vehicles from the police unit. So it means that things have actually deteriorated, and the levels of anger are now beyond the 2008 levels, which is the major thing here.
Bright Matonga, you served under President Mugabe. You used to be at the table when these decisions were made. He had massive, almost fanatical support from so many sectors of society, not only within ZANU-PF, but now we're seeing cracks. We're seeing criticism from the likes of Caiphus Msipa, the former ZANU-PF Politburo member, saying that Robert Mugabe risks being consumed by unrestrained public anger. We're seeing war veterans criticizing him. Is he losing his touch, and is he losing his base?
The situation definitely is very fragile. It's very tense. You don't know what is going to happen in the next hour, the next day, or even the next month. There's no cash, as has been reported in your report, and there is no trust between all the systems, really, because you've got your judiciary, you've got your police, you've got your people, you've got your political parties, you've got divisions within ZANU-PF. So it is a dog-eat-dog kind of scenario at the moment.
I look at the issue of no cash, Bright, and I see that even the Chinese, who usually get involved with no strings attached, they have conditions. And, you know, the reports come out that they want ZANU-PF to reform, to tackle corruption, they want leadership change and so on. With all of this in mind, at age 92, with his country potentially on the verge of burning to the ground. Is it time for President Mugabe to move on?
Is now seen to be oppressing people. There is no rule of law, so to speak. If you don't have your own currency to talk about, then there is a serious problem. At 92, we don't even have to discuss. We know what 92-year-olds should be at the moment. So let's put that aside. But the system itself has to, there has to be a new system, there has to be new blood, new ideas, and really investors cannot trust their money with such a system which is not accountable, which doesn't respect its own costs. We've had, the president attacking the judiciary. We have had the president attacking the army, the police. So really, there is no accountability on behalf of the president or even on behalf of the party, that is the ruling party. So there is a problem, there is a serious problem. We cannot run away from that. Something has to happen, and something should happen soon.
Tina Mambo, the High Court Justice Priscilla Chigumba's ruling recently that the government's arbitrary ban on opposition parties and civic groups' recent protests against President Robert Mugabe was invalid. She said it's invalid. Are you encouraged by the fact that the judiciary is standing firm?
Well, we can look at that in two ways. The first way is that the judge did quite nice in, articulating that in the first place, the Saunyama, the guy that issued that statutory instrument, is not qualified according to our constitution to do such a procedure. So I would say that the judge was quite spot on. But you will remember that the state has been given 7 days to appeal, and you will never know what happens when the state is going to appeal. So we do not want to really be in a celebratory mood as such as of yet. We are still watching the systems and how things unfold.
Bright Matonga, can Zimbabweans protest peacefully and freely without facing the wrath of the state?
Yes, they can. Yes, they can. They cannot for what has been happening. The judges even are now afraid to make any decisions. There was a case over this weekend where the judge said to the opposition parties that you need to invite the police to court. How can a judge make such a ruling? So there are serious problems. Even if people are going to make peaceful protests, the system is very cunning. They can set these things up. I don't buy in the issue that a police vehicle was burned down or even a television, radio car was burned down by protesters. I think it was an inside job so that they can thwart any form of protest.
Mr. Matunga, you say the system is very cunning. You were part of the decision-making for a long, long time. You were a face of the government to international media for a long, long time. Do you have any regrets serving this government, this cunning system, and serving the president during your years? No. When you are in a job, I believed what I was doing was the right thing to do. We defended people needed to be empowered. They need to be given land. But it's then what happens after people have been empowered, so to speak. They say there's indigenization, only a few people are empowered. So really, certain things have to come to an end. We've got a constitution that has to be respected. We don't see the constitution being respected. When you see a president attacking the judiciary, it's supposed to be independent, but it's not. When a president speaks who's not accountable to anybody, obviously it sends shivers to people. And the people of Zimbabwe have to come with a local solution, homegrown solution, and really not play into ZANU-PF's hands. It's been great to talk to you, Bright Matonga and Tino Mambao, and earlier Ngaba Machazi. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Coming up next on the Newsmakers, what's the significance of North Korea's latest nuclear test, and what can the international community do to rein in Pyongyang? And in Picture This, the most important ritual of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. How dangerous is North Korea? And what can the world do about it? A fifth nuclear test on Friday was Pyongyang's biggest yet, and possibly a sign of significant technological advances. It drew universal international condemnation, including from the country's biggest ally, China. The UN has threatened more sanctions, but do these have any impact on a defiant regime that's intent on developing its nuclear weapons capability? Yvette McCullough takes a look.
North Korea boasting about increasing its nuclear capabilities. On Friday, it said it had successfully conducted an underground nuclear test explosion, triggering a magnitude 5.3 earthquake. It's North Korea's fifth such test and its strongest ever. North Korea says it is now capable of mounting nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles. The international reaction has been condemnation.
Now our and the international community's patience is going beyond limit.
We need to, and we will, strongly protest against the actions.
We strongly urge North Korea to keep its commitment of non-proliferation.
He stands alone, and he invites even greater isolation.
This is North Korea's second nuclear test this year. In January, it said it detonated a hydrogen bomb, prompting UN sanctions. Sanctions, it would seem, that have done nothing to deter it from its nuclear ambitions. The Hermit Kingdom, secretive, isolated, defensive, but also a country trying to change its image. Pyongyang is starting to open up to tourists and to international media. AFP is the latest news agency to open a bureau in the capital. But North Korea's economy is struggling and its people need outside help. Despite this, Pyongyang has continued its provocative posturing by testing ballistic missiles and threatening nuclear attacks on its so-called enemies. Even condemnation from China, North Korea's economic lifeline and only major ally, isn't having an impact. What is North Korea's strategy and goal? Can it attract tourists and foreign funds while being more provocative and threatening than ever? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Oliver Hotham, who's managing editor of NK News, an independent website that focuses on North Korea. Thanks a lot for joining us, Oliver. Tell me a little bit about this paradox. On the one hand, North Korea is opening up, wants tourism. I managed to go there, ran in the Pyongyang Marathon, filmed without too much trouble. On the other hand, you have these threats and you have them conducting more nuclear tests. Demystify the paradox for us.
Well, it doesn't seem to have there doesn't seem to be a massive connection between the two things. North Korea, over the last 3 years, has continued its nuclear tests, has boasted about its increased capabilities, and through missile tests and through sort of big provocations, as you've described. But yet at the same time, tourism and, as you said, things like the Pyongyang Marathon, the opening up of the markets there, seem to be increasing. So there doesn't seem to be a massive connection between those two things. Whether or not now we might see a sort of that this test might be the last straw could be possible, but there isn't necessarily a precedent there.
Mm-hmm. So South Korea says the North is ready to carry out another nuclear test anytime soon. Do you believe that at this moment in time, North Korea poses a genuine, tangible nuclear threat to South Korea or the US or whoever?
Well, it's difficult to say. At the moment, they haven't been able to prove that they would be able to put the warhead onto the ballistic missile that would be able to, say, hit the mainland United States. But it certainly seems as though they're getting pretty close. And the analysts that we've spoken to have said that it could be something that might be able to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. And once that happens, once they can prove that capability, then certainly this regime that has such bellicose rhetoric and such seeming disregard for what the international community says of it, and no matter what sanctions seem to be enforced, it doesn't seem to make much difference. So I think once that happens, then we could say that North Korea would be a tangible nuclear threat. But until then, it's sort of about assessing their capabilities and about trying to work out what it is that can be done to stop them, essentially.
Are the Chinese facing a mega conundrum here? Because on the one hand, they don't want a a collapsed economy and a flood of refugees across their border. They want their neighbor to be somewhat stable, even though it might be totalitarian. And on the other hand, they want to rein in this rogue regime that uses any financial aid that it gets to beef up its nuclear arsenal and continues to threaten South Korea and the United States and others.
It does, and at one point you didn't mention was the fact that there's a great deal of trade between North Korea and China, which is one of the reasons that many have argued that the sanctions haven't been adequately enforced by China, simply because it's not necessarily in their economic interest. But at the same time, China has to is on this UN Security Council. It has to make a big show about being opposed to the nuclear tests and being opposed to instability more broadly on the Korean Peninsula. So they face this dichotomy, but at the same time, there's not really much they can do. North Korea's foreign minister went to China just a few days ago after the test, and it doesn't seem to have resulted in any kind of ramping down of North Korea's post-test bellicose sort of rhetoric in any way. So and in many ways the test might be a means for North Korea and for Pyongyang to assert its independence from China in lots of ways and say, well, we are going to pursue this nuclear path regardless of what China says, and knowing full well that there isn't really much that China can do about it in many ways. But again, we'll have to see what happens in the next few days and weeks, and when the Security Council comes up with something more binding from what they've already done, which is sort of simply general condemnation.
Yeah, one of the levers some individual countries are trying to use is to apply pressure by refusing to let North Korean guest workers work in their countries. I mean, the North Koreans send workers overseas to China, Russia, Qatar, Libya, Senegal, and so on, and they do multiple things, including making those wonderful bronze statues. Could that be a lever that might actually work, that it might put pressure on the North Koreans to say, hey, we need to do something different now because this was bringing in a lot of cash and it might not bring in that much cash anymore?
Well, in theory, it would. And I mean, a great deal of hard currency comes to the regime from the exporting of labor. But it's about whether or not, as I said before, whether or not these countries will be able to get on board. I mean, you mentioned Russia, for example, and Russia has actually, in the last few years, as North Korea has ramped up its nuclear tests, increased its economic relationships with the DPRK. And I mean, you mentioned Qatar as well. It's whether or not they would be in a position to take that risk, and obviously it's a double-sided relationship. I mean, Russia enjoys cheap North Korean exported labor, and North Korea enjoys the hard currency. So it really depends on the international geopolitics of this and whether or not these countries can be convinced to come on side and enforce these types of sanctions, which I'm not necessarily convinced will happen. Mm-hmm. I think if there was ever going to be a major sea change in this, it would have happened previously in the year on the first test of the year, which was the first in 3 years. And since that didn't happen then, I'm not necessarily convinced it'll happen now.
Oliver Hotham, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us. In today's picture this, in the searing Saudi heat, Muslim pilgrims have completed the most important ritual of the Hajj, making their way to Mount Arafat. Let's take a look. Our newsmaker today was Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe. The former independence hero has been in charge since 1980, but his hold on power is looking shakier than ever. A crippling economic crisis is pushing many Zimbabweans to the streets in anger, and even long-standing supporters are now starting to question the 92-year-old's leadership. One of our guests was Bright Matonga, the former Deputy Information Minister, and for many years the government's effective spokesman in the international media. He told us the country now needs new ideas and fresh blood. And he said that Mugabe is presiding over a system that's oppressing people. But whether it's political maneuvering or age that finally brings an end to the Mugabe era, there remains big questions over whether a peaceful transfer of power can take place and what post-Mugabe Zimbabwe will look like. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.